I'll go ahead and get started. So it's good to see a lot of friendly faces, and many of you I've never met before, haven't seen you before, so it's good to see a lot of new faces. What I'd like to do in the time that we have together is explore some ideas with you. These are very new ideas for me, but ones that I think, and I hope you would agree with me on, are rather mundane reasons or forms or lines of evidence that are often appealed to in favor of the truth of Christianity. And very generally, it's this, and we'll get more specific, that somehow a transformed life, and I'll tell you what I mean by a transformed life, a reorientation of the will towards certain Christ-like features, namely agape love, can actually provide evidence, not only for the one who has experiences from the first-person perspective of these kinds of transformative experiences, but also for those who witness these kinds of experiences in the lives of people close to them or in the lives of people they've never met before. So I want to explore some of these ideas with you, explain what I mean by a transformative experience. I don't just mean a one-time, one-off religious experience. So if you could map what I'm doing here this afternoon with you, it would be something along the lines of exploring one kind of argument or line of evidence from religious experience. So this is all new terrain for me, so I'm excited to explore it with you, and hopefully we'll have some time to talk about this together. All right, so here's what I'm aiming to do. Here are my tentative claims. Here's where I'd like to go. Tenets that I'd like to explore. A would be this. These are on your handout. That what I call spiritually transformative experiences constitute first and second person evidence for Christianity. First and second person evidence for Christianity. And I'll explain what I mean by these as we go along. That is, the having of these spiritually transformative experiences, as well as the witnessing of these experiences in the life of someone close to you, or again, like I said, even if you don't know the person. If somebody reports or testifies to having been once one way, I was blind, but now I see. What, if any, kinds of evidence might this confer on the truth of Christianity? So I want to float the thesis that these kinds of experiences, whether from the first-person perspective, and what I mean by second-person perspective, is say, if I witness these in the lives of Josh, these kinds of transformative experiences, whether that can provide reason for me to believe that Christianity is true. Okay? And then second, that Christian belief can actually be epistemically justified, and I'll explain what I mean by that as well, on the basis of this kind of evidence. Often you'll hear floating around, I think especially in apologetic circles, is when it comes to the transformation, or at least the alleged transformation, that one is claiming that God has wrought in their heart or their soul, might be evidence for the one who experiences it, but it certainly doesn't constitute evidence for, say, me. I'm not the one who's had that experience. I'm not the one who's allegedly undergone these transformation of one's will and one's character. So it might be good evidence for you to believe, but it sort of leaves, places no evidential demand on me. Doesn't give me reason to believe. And to be honest, as I'll emphasize in the course of the talk, I'm getting a lot of these ideas from John Wesley. So I'll give you some straightforward quotations from the great Methodist theologian John Wesley, who actually thinks what he calls internal evidence for Christianity, these kinds of transformative experiences, can constitute evidence for one, from the first-person perspective, but also for you, if you witness these changes in my own life. So we'll take a look at that. So A and B are the areas that I'd like to explore with you this afternoon. Actually, talking to some friends here, John in particular, I think there are many different ways an argument like this could proceed. Say, from the inference to the best explanation, suppose all of us stood up and said, I used to be this way, now I'm this way. And if that can be evidenced by authentic works of love in your own heart for God and for others, there needs to be an explanation. Now, there might be a non-theistic explanation, but at least you're going to want to find some explanation as to what explains these claims of transformation. What might explain these? So you could proceed on the basis of an inference to the best explanation, or you could proceed, as philosophers say, abductively. I'm going to take a slightly different approach to these issues today with you. All right. So you notice there's some key terms in A and B here. You've got this idea of evidence. You have epistemic justification. So these are philosophical terms that I want to just pause and briefly unpack together. All right. So what I mean here by evidence is simply something that can indicate the truth of a proposition. Something that is indicative of the truth of a proposition. And I have in parentheses here, perhaps fallibly. So say smoke is indicative of fire. That would be an example of smoke providing evidence for the true proposition that there is fire. That would be an example of evidence that indicates the truth of a proposition. The proposition being here that there is fire. The presence of smoke in the vicinity might lead you to conclude, in fact, reasonably, hey, there's fire. So all I mean by evidence at this point, for the truth of some proposition P, is that it indicates the truth of P. Evidence is in some sense indicative. It's a sign, it's a reliable indicator toward the truth of a particular proposition. Now, my own view, so you might think of this as a highly opinionated discussion or reflection on the nature and evidential value of a transformed life. So I'm coming at this from a particular perspective about what evidence is, whether evidence is necessary and sufficient for what philosophers call epistemic justification, and what kinds of evidence there really are. Okay? So here's my own view on this. I hold to what I call evidence pluralism, and basically all that means is that there are different types of evidence. The presence of smoke can be a kind of indicator for the truth of the proposition that there's fire. Smoke can be evidence. Fingerprints on a murder weapon can be evidence. Surveillance footage of somebody can be evidence of the truth of their being at the scene of the crime or something like that. So I don't think propositions alone serve or play the role as evidence. I think evidence can be, that role of evidence of indicating the truth of a proposition can be played by many different things. That's just my own view on this. And so I'm going to argue that, well, not argue, I'm going to stipulate that experiences can play the role of evidence. Okay? Thomas Reid, a great early modern philosopher, I think one of the only sane early modern philosophers, in my opinion, he said this: we give the name of evidence to whatever is the ground of belief. So if I ask you, Josh, why do you believe that there's fire? You might say, well, the presence of smoke, or the smell of smoke. These are all indicative of the truth of the proposition that there's fire. So I'm going to be assuming evidence is simply that which reliably indicates the truth of a proposition in question, and I'm going to assume that many different things can play that role. Okay. All right. So if you look at B, the second central aim of the talk is to show that these certain kinds of experiences can provide evidence for certain beliefs. But also, it can actually, those kinds of experiences can epistemically justify. Okay, so here's what I mean by epistemic justification. Doxastic attitude A towards proposition P is epistemically justified for person S at T if having that attitude toward that proposition fits the evidence S has at T. And there are no known defeaters to that proposition. Let me rephrase that. Belief is justified if it fits one's evidence. Now here I'm taking a stance that evidence is just sufficient for epistemic justification. I'm not claiming that it's necessary and sufficient. I'm just saying if you have evidence for the truth of a proposition, say the proposition here is that there's fire. It's reasonable, or you're epistemically justified. Think about it this way. You're intellectually responsible in believing that there's fire if you have evidence that fits that belief. That's all I'm getting at here. Evidence is sufficient for epistemic justification. So you're intellectually responsible, epistemically justified in believing that there's fire if you have good evidence to believe there's fire. In this case, that might take the form of you might smell smoke. You might see smoke. That would be something that indicates the truth of a proposition. So it's a pretty broad claim here, pretty loose claim, that evidence is sufficient for epistemic justification. And so when philosophers talk about, is belief in God or is Christian belief epistemically justified, they mean something like this. Is it above board intellectually speaking? Is it intellectually responsible or irresponsible to believe in the tenets of Christianity? Or are you somehow flouting your intellectual duties or not being a responsible inquirer in believing in the truths of Christianity? All right. So epistemic justification amounts to having evidence that fits some particular belief. All right. So on to what I call transformative experiences. Actually, there's been some outstanding work on the nature of transformative experiences by a philosopher named Laurie Paul. So if you're interested in reading more about transformative experiences, not just as it pertains to religious experiences, but as we'll see, it's much broader, but we're focusing our attention here on religious experiences. Look at Laurie Paul's book called Transformative Experience. Excellent work. So here's what I mean by transformative experience. So up top here, an experience is transformative if it's an experience of the reorientation of one's volitional center, that is one's will, including one's core loves. So an experience is transformative if it's an experience of the reorientation of one's volitional center, in particular, the changing of one's core loves. So there are a host of different transformative experiences one might have that might reorient one's will and change one's core loves. Not just religious experiences are like this, right? Giving birth, I'm told, my wife tells me, is a transformative experience. Being a parent is a transformative experience. Taking a college class where your eyes are open for the first time and you begin to see the value of serious, substantive intellectual inquiry. Your volitional center, your will is reoriented towards, and you begin to love different things. In fact, if you read Augustine's Confessions, which I see some of my students in here are reading that right now, he has several transformative experiences along his journey. And it's actually the reading of certain texts that he says God put in his place to open his eyes and to reorient his loves towards base appetites to wisdom and truth. So there are many different kinds of transformative experiences, not all of which pertain to spiritual transformation, is what I want you to see. It could be falling in love, for example. Could be a transformative experience where your will is reoriented and your loves are changed. Your core loves are redirected and changed. But what I want to talk about with you this afternoon is what I call an S-transformative experience, a spiritually transformative experience. Not just some vague spiritually transformative experience, but an experience, and this is on your handout, of the reorientation of one's volitional center, including one's core loves, toward other-centered, Christ-like agape love. So notice the will is being ordered towards something in particular. It's other-centered, Christ-like agape love. So it's an experience of one's will being transformed and changed to loving things one previously didn't love, namely loving one's neighbor, an increase in love of God and neighbor. Okay, and I'm sure many of you in here can testify to this reality in your own soul. Okay, so that's what I mean by an S-transformative experience, and that's going to be the target of what I'm going to want to talk about going forward. So a very specific kind of transformative experience, the reorientation of one's will towards other-centered, Christ-like agape love. Okay, so of course, I wish you could see that better. Is there a way to kill the lights up front? Do you know? Can you give it a shot, maybe? Yeah. If not, we won't worry about it. Okay, don't worry about it. Of course, of course, for many of you in here, you're aware of the great transformative, at least the initial transformative experience of Saul of Tarsus, right? Recounted in Acts 9, Acts 22, and Acts 26. So I just use this as an example of what I'm talking about. Okay, so I'll mention some brief remarks here that Luke gives from Acts 9. So Luke says this, but Saul, so we get a portrait of Saul's volitional center prior to at least his initial transformative experience. But Saul, still breathing threats and murder against the disciples of the Lord. Breathing threats and murder. Doesn't that just give you an apt snapshot into the volitional center of the Apostle Paul? Went to the high priest and asked him for letters to the synagogues at Damascus, so that if he found any belonging to the way, that is, to Christianity, who were disciples of the Lord Jesus, men or women, he might bring them bound to Jerusalem. So he was going out of his way to enslave and entrap and bind Christians, and indeed to murder Christians. So all we're doing is we're getting a snapshot into Paul's volitional center, the direction of his will prior to his initial transformative experience. And I won't read this, but check out chapter 9, 3 through 19. That's where he has his Damascus Road experience with the risen Lord. Aftershot here. For some days, this is after that initial transformative experience. He says, for some days, he was with the disciples at Damascus, and immediately he proclaimed Jesus in the synagogues, saying, he is the Son of God. And all who heard him were amazed and said, is not this the man who made havoc in Jerusalem of those who called upon his name? So notice there's an immediate context of people who were like, wait a second. Are we talking about the same person? Right? And has he not come here for this purpose, to bring them bound before the chief priests? But Saul increased all the more in strength and confounded the Jews who lived in Damascus by proving that Jesus was the Christ. Elsewhere in Acts, Luke recounts, after Paul has this initial transformative experience, he goes to the disciples in Jerusalem, and he says, hey, guys, I was blind, now I see, and they're just like, wait a second. They're very timid to take him in because they know exactly he has a reputation. His reputation precedes him. I forgot who it was that he actually talks the other disciples into saying, yo, he's good to go. Anybody remember who that was? Barnabas. Sweet. Thank you. So, snapshot. The volitional, the direction of the will of the apostle, or Saul, before this transformative experience and afterwards. That's what I want you to see. Of course, he could serve as a limit case. This is a very extreme case, right? You go from one who's previously breathing murderous threats to one who's now proclaiming this same Jesus. Something has been transformed and changed in this man, okay? Other biblical texts that underscore this idea of transformation in one's will or volitional center as a kind of indicator for the truth of Christianity would be John 13:34. It says, a new commandment, Jesus says, a new commandment I give to you, that you love one another just as I have loved you. You also are to love one another. By this, all people will know that you are my disciples. Let me say that again. By this, all people will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another. So Christ-like love here, the manifestation of that very same love that Christ manifests to his disciples, is somehow, well, I'll get into this here in a second, but it's somehow indicative of the real transforming power of God in Christ. And then you have also 2 Corinthians 3, 1 through 3. This is my favorite biblical text, to at least frame out this idea as to what exactly is this idea that we're going to look at philosophically here more in depth. 2 Corinthians 3, 1 through 3. So if you know the context of 2 Corinthians, where Paul is aiming to justify his apostolic ministry, it's being called into question, and Paul over and over again in 2 Corinthians is trying to justify that he is a genuine apostle of the Lord Jesus. He says this, are we beginning to commend ourselves again? Or do we need, as some do, letters of recommendation to you or from you? You yourselves are our letter of recommendation, written on our hearts to be known and read by all. And you show that you are a letter from Christ delivered by us, written not with ink, but with the Spirit of the living God, not on tablets of stone, but on tablets of human hearts. So somehow the changed life of the Corinthians here, Paul's pointing to them and saying, look, you want evidence of my being a true apostle? You want evidence of the reality of God's action in my ministry? Look at these transformed lives. Look at, I love these living letters of recommendation. Right? Isn't that a neat idea? So that's at least some biblical texts that point towards, suggest, indicate towards this idea of evidence of a transformed life being some kind of evidence in favor of the reality of God's action, transformative action in the lives of persons, agents. All right, so let's begin to do some epistemology here. So you've got this concept of transformative evidence. What I mean by transformative evidence is principally going to take the form of experiences, transformative experiences, okay? And that's defined on your handout. That's why I gave you a handout so you can reference back to these definitions, so you don't get lost in the flow of the talk here. So transformational evidence consists of transformative experiences, one of two kinds of transformative experiences. On the one hand, you have what I call first-person transformative evidence. So remember, all transformative evidence takes the form of experience, a certain kind of experience. Okay? A first-person transformative experience is an experience of the reorientation of one's own volitional center, including one's core loves toward other-centered Christ-like agape love. This is a kind of experience that is irreducibly from the inside out, so to speak. It's not the sort of thing that I could share clearly with you what it's like to have this kind of experience of the reorientation of one's own will. I'm sure many of you have a story. I have a story as well. I've experienced God's transformative work in my own life such that I knew who I once was, and I know who I am now. That's a kind of first-personal transformative experience. It's just an experience of having been once blind and now seeing. Also, the experience of oneself being gradually transformed into Christ-like agape love. So that's also an ongoing process. This isn't like a light switch, one-time deal, and you're done. It's the progressive experience of one's growing in other-centered love. So the key point here is it's from the inside out. It's first-personal. It's a first-personal experience. Now, there's a principle in epistemology called the principle of credulity. And it states this. In the absence of defeaters, we should believe what seems or appears evident to us. In the absence of defeaters, we should, or it's reasonable to believe, what seems evident or obvious to us. So the idea here is that first-person transformative experiences, this what it is like experience to have one's will reoriented towards other-centered, Christ-like agape love, can actually serve as grounds for believing that things actually are the way they seem, that one's will truly is being reordered and reoriented towards other-centered, Christ-like agape love. That is, that a genuine, what I call a genuine transformation, a genuine spiritual transformation has actually occurred. Because right now we're only at the level of experiences, right? You might have independent reason for thinking that these experiences aren't vertical. We'll get to that. Those are defeaters. Okay? But all I'm talking about is at the level of experience. When I introspect in my own soul, in my own thinking, in the state of my own will, it strikes me as obvious and evident that I have experiences of my will being reordered toward other-centered Christ-like agape love. Both at a moment in time, this might be different in terms of how you experience this in your own soul for those of you who know Christ. For many of us, this just might be different. Okay? But that's what I mean here, that these kinds of first-person transformative experiences can actually be grounds. They can actually be the epistemic grounds for believing that things really are the way they seem, that you really are being transformed, and we'll see why that's relevant. Because if you really are being transformed by God towards other-centered Christ-like love, guess what that entails? That entails there is a God, and that entails that he's working in the lives of human agents, which is just Christian theism. with a few more bells and whistles we'll get to. All right. Another kind of transformative, so that's first-person S transformation, transformative experience. There's also what I call second-person S transformative experience. These are increasingly becoming more of a mouthful to say. But nonetheless, second-person S transformative experience. I distinguish between what I call unattested and attested second-person as transformative experiences. What do I mean by this? What do I mean by an unattested second-person transformative experience? That's an experience of the testimony of another's claim to an S transformative experience. So if Josh testifies to me, and he says, Ross, I was once blind and now I see. That would be an example of a second person. Why is it second person? It's because Josh is testifying to me. Another, a you, is testifying to me. It's not something that I've experienced from the inside out, so to speak. But say I know Josh, I've been around Josh, and we'll see here in a second, it might even matter how long I've known Josh, my background experience, my background knowledge of Josh. I knew, say, what he was really like. But wait a second, now Josh is coming to me and testifying that God has done something radical in my soul. What is he testifying to? He's testifying that God has really, truly acted and transformed, reordered his will towards other-centered, Christ-like love. That's just a testimony, right? And by testimony, I mean it in the strict epistemic sense here, not just like giving a testimony, so to speak. I just mean that I believe it on testimonial grounds because Josh tells me so. However, an unattested second person as transformative experience is, let's say I didn't know Josh. Let's say I had no background evidence or knowledge of what Josh was once like. And let's say this is the first time I've ever met Josh. So I have no independent evidence that Josh is actually growing in other-centered love for God and neighbor. I have no evidence for that. All I have is a claim. But I have no independent evidence that, oh wow, his life is bearing fruit, the same fruit that the New Testament says it should be bearing, if it has truly been, if there is genuine transformation taking place there. Does that make sense? Okay, so an unattested is just a testimonial claim on its own, bare bones. An attested second person S transformative experience is a testimony of another's claim to an S transformative experience, but that's attested by independent evidence. And by independent evidence, I mean growth in, say, theological virtue, faith, hope, and love of God, and love of neighbor. I can actually see Josh growing, see Josh being increasingly transformed in the image of Christ, because let's say we're friends, and I see him every week, every day. I can see something happening in Josh's life where he loves different things. His life and his actions look very different. Okay? So that's what I mean by an attested second-person S transformative experience. Versus, say, just meeting Josh and Josh telling me on the street in the blue, hey, I was once blind, now I see. That would just be a bare, unattested second-person S transformative experience. Now, just like with the principle of credulity, there's also a principle in epistemology that thinkers like Richard Swinburne defend. It's called a principle of testimony. Principle of testimony. In the absence of defeaters, we should believe what people tell us about their experiences. What would be an example of some defeaters, reasons for thinking otherwise? Well, suppose you've got a history with this person and they're a habitual liar or something like that, right? That would be a defeater. Somebody asserts P, and you know this person's pretty shady. I've got experience with this person. They're reliably wrong. They don't carefully inquire or something like that. That might be a defeater. It would no longer be reasonable to believe what that person tells you about their own experiences if you have counter evidence to suggest that they're not reliable, for example. Okay? So the idea here is, using the principle of testimony, is that second-person S transformative experiences are grounds for believing that things are how another person reports them to be. And how would that be? Well, if somebody comes up to you and says, I was once blind and now I see, whether that's an attested or unattested, or attested or unattested by independent evidence, The idea here is that that testimony can actually serve as grounds, based on the principle of testimony, for believing that things really are the way that person, unless you have a defeater, believing that things really are the way they've experienced them to be. That is, that they're not completely delusional or hysterical in making up these kinds of S-transformative experiences. I'm tempted to skip this next section, but let me mention it. You have what I call direct transformational evidence and indirect transformational evidence. This is getting more into the details about what your view of the epistemology of testimony is. So for maybe some of you philosophy students, you might find this interesting. I'll just mention this. What I call direct transformational evidence is when an S-transformative experience serves as non-inferential evidence for the truth of Christianity. So you've got two options here, largely based on whether you think testimony, that is believing something purely on testimonial grounds, can actually provide non-inferential reasons for believing something. That is, somebody testifies that P, somebody testifies that there's a fire down 2 houses down. You don't know that person, but you immediately form the belief there's a fire 2 houses down. That would be an example of a testimony serving as non-inferential grounds here. That is, you immediately and spontaneously form that belief, and reasonably so. That person's testifying that P is actually providing non-inferential grounds or evidence for the truth that there's a fire 2 houses down. So in the context of S-transformative experiences, somebody comes along, and suppose you think testimony can confer non-inferential grounds or reasons for believing something. Somebody comes along and says, I was once blind and now I see. Now, you don't know that person. You don't know that person from Adam. If testimony on its own can provide non-inferential grounds, then you could have direct transformational evidence here in favor of a well-grounded belief that that person actually has had these transformational experiences, and based on the principle of testimony, how things seem to that person are probably how they really are. They really have undergone an S transformation, a spiritual transformation. But that's going to depend on whether you think testimonial grounds can be non-inferential. That is to say, it could be direct. What do I mean by indirect? When a second person S-transformative experience serves as inferential evidence for the truth of Christianity. So what I mean here is, on the basis of Tina's testimony to God's transformative action in her life, suppose it's attested. All right? Suppose it's attested, you've got independent evidence of the fact that Tina is growing in her love for God and her love for others. She's exhibiting the fruits of the Spirit, exactly what Christianity predicts she should be experiencing and what her soul should look like after walking with Christ. Suppose on the basis of Tina's testimony, and it's a tested testimony, that is, you're walking with Tina and she's growing and you see that evidence in her life, we thereby have inferential grounds for believing that Tina's life has indeed been transformed by God. What do I mean by that? You can have indirect transformational evidence that God really is working in Tina's life. God really does exist. He really is transforming Tina through Christ, by the power of the Spirit in Christ, on the basis of, one, her testimony. She's saying, I was blind, now I see, and the independent evidence that's confirming that testimony. Her life is confirming these testimonies. Her life is confirming her claims, so to speak. That might provide you indirect evidence, indirect transformational evidence, that Christianity is true. That is, that God really is operational in her life by the Spirit in Christ, making her more like Christ. But of course, that entails that God exists, that the Spirit really is an agent that's operative in her life, and so on and so on. Okay? So you've got S-transformative experiences can be either direct evidence or indirect transformational evidence for the truth of Christianity. I'll lay out the whole argument here in a second. But I've mentioned along the way when philosophers talk about evidence, often they want to talk about evidence, whether it's good evidence for me, whether believing some proposition, say that there is fire in the vicinity, might be good evidence. I might have good evidence that you don't have, for example. All right, so suppose I'm on the phone with you. I see smoke rising from 2 houses down, and I tell you there's a fire 2 houses down from my house. Now, I might be in possession of stronger evidence for believing that there's a fire 2 houses down than you. Say, I just report to you there's a fire 2 houses down, and you believe it on the basis of my testimony. But I'm looking and I'm seeing and I'm smelling, for example, smoke coming from 2 houses down. Does that make sense? So I might have stronger evidence for believing that there's a fire 2 houses down. You have evidence as well, but often what counts as stronger evidence might be stronger for me than you, depending on context. So here's a claim that I mentioned before. I find this plausible. Suppose my best friend, Tim. I've known Tim a long time. And suppose Tim, his life was just a mess. And I know that firsthand walking with Tim. And suppose the Lord gets a hold of his life, and increasingly I see his will reoriented, transformed into the image of Christ more and more each day. And so my closeness, my relational closeness to Tim, actually gives me really good evidence for believing something's happened to Tim that, say, Josh might not have. Josh doesn't know Tim. So what might constitute really good evidence for me, at least stronger evidence, because of my social or relational proximity to another human being. How many of you have somebody in your life where you could claim this of? You've seen them, they were once like this, and now they're like this, other than yourself. Anybody? Where you could say, what in the world? Something happened. Now, you can give a non-theistic explanation, but the question is that a plausible explanation, right? So what I'm saying is, if you're close to that person, you might have relevant background evidence and experience that might shape how strong of evidence that person's testimony serves. It might be stronger evidence for me than it is for, say, Josh, who doesn't know my friend Tim. But I know Tim, and this is something has taken place here. That's the idea. All right, so I'd mentioned a lot of this I'm just getting from John Wesley, the great Methodist theologian, one of my favorite thinkers. He says this in his work, A Plain Account of Genuine Christianity. Wesley distinguishes between what he calls internal evidence for Christianity and what he calls external evidence or traditional evidence for Christianity. By traditional evidence, Wesley means something like theistic arguments, historical arguments, the kinds of arguments that we marshal in conferences like this. Okay, arguments for the existence of God, arguments for the reality of the resurrection, the reliability of Scripture, those sorts of things. This is what Wesley has to say about internal evidence. Internal evidence, it's not entirely clear to me what he means, but one aspect I think of what he does mean is an internal witness of the Holy Spirit, kind of a Romans 8 phenomenon where the Spirit testifies with my spirit that I'm a child of God. But also, too, I think he means a transformed life. Somebody's life actually exhibiting real change can provide evidence not only for the person, but also for somebody who's witnessing this change. Okay? He says this, and this internal evidence I conceive to be the strongest evidence for the truth of Christianity. That's a strong statement. Whether you agree with that or not, I'm not sure if I do, but he says it's a form of evidence at the very least. He says, quote, but no length of time can possibly affect the strength of this internal evidence. It is equally strong, equally new, through the course of 1,700 years. It passes now, even as it has done from the beginning, directly from God into the believing soul. Do you suppose time will ever dry up the stream? Oh no, it shall never be cut off. Traditional evidence is of an extremely complicated nature, necessarily including so many and so various considerations that only men of strong and clear understanding can be sensible of its full force. On the contrary, how plain and simple is this, and how level to the lowest capacity? Is not this the sum? One thing I know, I was blind, but now I see. An argument, look, he calls it an argument, which is interesting to me. An argument so plain that a peasant, a child, may feel all its force. I'm going to extract some general principles about transformational evidence in an apologetic context here, but let's just, I want to get these quotes before you. Now, Wesley, he entertains an objection. Okay? He entertains an objection, and it goes like this. He says, perhaps you'll say this, but this internal evidence of Christianity affects only those in whom the promise is fulfilled. It is no evidence to me, right? Do you hear what he's saying here? It might be evidence for you that God really does exist and he's bringing about these transformations in your soul, but that doesn't constitute evidence for me, right? It might serve as first personal as transformative experience and thus evidence, but it wouldn't do anything evidentially for me, wouldn't give me any reason for believing that God exists and that he's active in the life of your soul. He says there's truth. This is interesting. He says there's truth in this objection. It does affect them chiefly, but it does not affect them only. And here's what I want you to see. It does not affect them only. It cannot, in the nature of things, be so strong an evidence to others as it is to them. Right? Because for one, it's inside out, so to speak. And just as I'm having perceptual experiences of a computer in front of me, I might be able to report those experiences to you, but you can't feel the force of those perceptual experiences as much as I do, because I'm the one who's having these perceptual experiences, at least from the inside out. He says, it cannot, in the nature of things, be so strong an evidence to others as it is to them, and yet it may bring a degree of evidence. A degree of evidence. It may reflect some light on you also. He goes on. He says, now transfer this to the case before us, and those who were blind but now see, those who were sick many years but now are healed, those who were miserable but now are happy. Will afford you also a very strong evidence of the truth of Christianity. Now, the italics are in the original here. I'm not adding these. These are all Wesley. He says, it will afford you also a very strong evidence of the truth of Christianity. It might not be as strong as the evidence it might confer on your believing that Christianity is true. But if I'm witnessing these reports to these transformative experiences, it confers some evidence, or it's indicative in some way or another, or it's a sign that points in some way or another to God really is on the move and he's doing things. So remember, evidence, all it is indicative. It points. It's a sign towards something. It doesn't infallibly prove. Right? Even the smoke, the presence of smoke with respect to fire. It could be a barbecue, right? Which there would be a fire anyway, but you know what I mean, right? So it doesn't infallibly show or demonstrate, but it's suggestive or indicative. It could be defeated, though, is what I want you to see. Okay, so let's look at, let me finish the quote, sorry. He says, it will afford you also a very strong evidence for the truth of Christianity, as strong as can be in the nature of things till you experience it in your own soul. In this, though it be allowed they are but plain men and in general weak understanding, nay, though some of them should be mistaken in other points and hold opinions which cannot be defended. All right, so let's move to the fittingness of this kind of evidence for the truth of Christianity for apologetics. If these kinds of transformative experiences and reports to these kinds of transformative experiences are real forms of evidence, albeit that can be defeated in the presence of defeaters, what apologetic value might appealing to these kinds of lines of evidence have? And so these are straight from Wesley, at least 3 of these are straight from Wesley. So Wesley, remember, he mentions that this kind of evidence is easily accessible. You don't need a PhD. You don't need to have a specialization in metaphysics to be able to understand transformational evidence and be able to grasp it and ascertain someone's transformed life. So this is what he says. Transformational evidence is easily accessible. He says, how plain and simple is this, and how level to the lowest capacity? Even a peasant or a child can feel its force. So Wesley thinks transformational evidence is easily accessible. He also says that it's available to all persons, all times, and all places. Doesn't discriminate as to who can have this kind of evidence. You don't need to be a philosopher and be able to work out a certain cosmological argument. That's nice, that's wonderful, but for Wesley, this kind of evidence, you don't need that. It's easily accessible in that sense. He also thinks that it's more immediate, direct, and lively than other forms of theistic evidence. It's more immediate, direct, and lively. He says this, I love this quote. He says, traditional evidence of Christianity, theistic arguments, historical arguments, as it were, stands, as it were, a great way off, way over there. And therefore, although it speaks loud and clear, notice he thinks it speaks loud and clear. It doesn't mumble, this traditional evidence for Christianity. He thinks it speaks loud and clear, yet makes a less lively impression than oneself experiencing God's transformative work in one's own life, as well as knowing somebody who says, I was once blind, now I see, and look at the evidence of that in my life. Makes a deeper, more lively impression or impact. It gives us an account of what was transacted long ago, still talking about traditional evidence, in far distant times as well as places, whereas the inward evidence is intimately present to all persons, at all times and in all places. It is nigh thee in thy mouth and in thy heart, if thou believest in the Lord Jesus Christ. So he thinks it's more immediate, direct, and lively. Thirdly, he thinks, and this is one that I'm rather fond of, he says that transformational evidence highlights the goodness and desirability. So we often talk about the truth of Christianity in these contexts, which is a worthy aim. But apologetics should have something to say about the desirability and the goodness of Christianity, not just its truth. Wesley says elsewhere, he says this, you'll see the beauty and loveliness of Christianity when it is rightly understood, and you are sure there is nothing to be desired in comparison of it. He says this in the context of witnessing another person's transformed life. He goes on to say, you see clearly how desirable Christian faith is, even on account of its own intrinsic value. And he says, you are a witness, that is, the person who's witnessing from a second-person perspective, a transformed life. He says, you are a witness that the holiness and happiness above described can be attained no other way. The more you have labored after virtue and happiness, the more convinced you are of this. So he thinks it can help underscore not only the truth, but also the goodness and desirability. Look at this person's will being reordered towards the good in other-centered, Christ-like love. There's some sort of desirability or beauty to that for Wesley. And I think he's right about that. You might see the truth of a cosmological argument in terms of its conclusion, and it might strike you as, yeah, that seems true to me. But I think Wesley would say, it doesn't strike you as desirable or good necessarily. And we should aim to show the truth, the goodness, and the desirability of Christianity, not just as truth. That's a worthy aim. And lastly, this is one that I've added with some insights from Paul Moser. Paul Moser says this, that this kind of evidence, he actually calls this personifying evidence. That is evidence that's personified in a human agent. That it can actually uniquely represent the Christian God and God's redemptive aims. There's something about this form of evidence for Christianity that can more clearly represent the God of Christianity and his real and genuine purposes for humanity, other than, say, a historical argument for the resurrection or a cosmological argument. So only the type of evidence that is necessarily embodied in a personal agent, what Moser calls personifying evidence, can adequately point an inquirer to the reality of God as not just an abstract proposition, but as a loving, intentional, personal agent on the one hand, but also that he not only aims to just let us know that he exists, right? That's not his primary aim. His primary aim is to get us in a right relationship to himself, to reorient our wills around what's truly, truly good for us And that's part of his redemptive aims. So something about the transformation of the human will is going to be pointing towards God's redemptive aims in his dealing with humanity. That is not just getting us to believe that he exists. Even the demons believe, James tells us, right? But he wants to actually to change us to be more like him. All right, so the overall argument looks something like this. One, experience is a type of evidence that indicates the truth of propositions. That's just a general claim about the nature of evidence, and experience being only one type of evidence, if you're an evidence pluralist. Two, S transformative experiences can provide evidence for the truth of propositions about S transformations. Three, genuine S transformations or genuine spiritual transformations entail the truth of Christian theism. If these are real spiritual transformations, where the will really is being reordered towards other-centered Christ-like love, that entails the truth of Christian theism, if it's a genuine one. Therefore, S transformative experiences provide direct or indirect evidence for the truth of Christian theism. And therefore, Christian belief may be epistemically justified if you think epistemic justification consists in the having of evidence. If your belief fits the evidence, then you can be epistemically justified in believing that Christian theism is true. If it's based or grounded on these kinds of evidence, transformative evidence, whether from the first-person perspective or second-person perspective. All right, so if you notice, I've said along the way that in the absence of defeaters. Now, you might have a defeater here, right? So for example, I might believe on the basis of a perceptual experience that there's a computer in front of me, right? Now, I'm reasonable in the absence of defeaters in believing that there really is a computer in front of me. But suppose I'm told that there's an elaborate joke that's being played on me right now, and there's some sort of projector that's projecting a very lifelike computer image on the podium right now. There really isn't a computer in front of me. Now, if I'm told or made aware of this scenario, I've acquired what philosophers call a defeater. That is, it's no longer reasonable for me, once I learn of this defeater, to believe that there's a computer in front of me. Okay? So the question here is, are there good defeaters? Now, there are many you could give here, and I only have time to look at one. Might there be a defeater here to these kinds of experiences that keep them from being good evidence for the truth of Christianity? All right, so here's one. Perhaps there's a non-theistic explanation for these things. Isn't it more plausible to say that some other non-theistic factor is responsible for an agent's transformative experiences? Must you really appeal to Christianity to explain the change in someone's life? Aren't there alternative explanations that are equally plausible that you could appeal to, which would undermine these kinds of experiences serving as evidence or indicative of the truth of Christianity? Couldn't there be other things going on here, or isn't it even more plausible to believe other things are going on? Now, I want you should think through this objection yourselves. Okay, so just because this is how I'm thinking through these things doesn't mean that's how you have to think through them. So here's some things that I've come up with just reflecting on this the last few days about how one might reply to this potential defeater to transformational evidence as serving as grounds for the truth of Christianity. Now, notice the objection says, or the defeater says, or the potential defeater says, it's more plausible that the explanation for these S transformative experiences. Notice, just because one has an S transformative experience doesn't mean there's a real S transformation, is what I want you to see. One is just reporting an experience. Just like I could report an experience of the computer, and there really isn't a computer there, right? But experiences can be indicative or signs that there really is a computer there. Same with these S transformative experiences. So suppose somebody says it's more likely that something else is going on here. I think that's going to depend on whether you have independent background evidence for the truth of Christianity, or if you have independent background evidence for atheism. Whether or not Christianity is a better explanation here is going to depend, and this is where I think one weakness of this line of reasoning for evidence for Christianity, on its own, as a standalone response, I think you need to shore it up with other theistic evidences myself to be more plausible. So the question of whether a non-theistic explanation is going to be more plausible here depends on, well, do you have good independent background evidence that say atheism is true? If you do, then yeah, it will be more plausible to think that something else is going on here. Does that make sense? But if you have good independent background evidence, say you're coming to these reports of these S-transformative experiences, and you already have good independent reason for thinking God exists and he's revealed himself in the person of Jesus of Nazareth. If that's the case, then it won't necessarily be more probable to think there's some other explanation going on here. So it does depend on your background knowledge, whether it's more plausible to think it has a theistic or non-theistic explanation. So that matters here. Okay. All right, reply 2. Now, notice, at least according to the New Testament, Christianity has, it predicts these kinds of experiences. It says that if one has truly been converted and regenerated, one will actually have these real experiences as well as real transformation of their wills. This should be going on. This is what's called growing in Christ, right? So Christian theism actually predicts these kinds of experiences should be happening. So it has predictive power, which I think suggests or at least helps support the idea that it's not more plausible to think that a non-theistic explanation is at work here. If you can point and say, well, look, this is exactly what we would expect if Christianity were true, because it predicts these kinds of experiences, that at least lends favor towards a theistic versus a non-theistic explanation. And then lastly, you might appeal to the fact that, look, if Tim was the only one claiming to have these kinds of experiences, right, that would be one thing. But it should be evidentially relevant that there are global and historical corroborating transformative experiences where a lot of people are claiming to have the very same transformative experiences. So that at least should carry some evidential weight towards saying the best explanation of these kinds of experiences is the Christian theistic explanation. So those are three first replies to this potential defeater as to why this is perhaps a potential defeater, but not a real defeater, to this serving as genuine evidence. Now, there might be others. In fact, I know there are other defeaters, potential defeaters, but that's one that we have time to look at. Hey, you guys, thanks for your time. I'm really glad you're here, and yeah, that's all I got.